March 3rd, 1943, 07:55 hours. Bismarck Sea, north of New Guinea. The trembling hand of Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamada gripped the rail of destroyer Shirayuki as he watched the horizon transform into a nightmare of approaching aircraft. No force on Earth should possess such numbers. They come like locusts, blocking out the morning Sunday. His diary entry, recovered months later from the waters off Gunn Island, would capture the final moments before American innovation shattered Japanese naval doctrine forever. Through the bridge windows, he witnessed something that contradicted everything the Imperial Navy had taught him about air warfare. American bombers descended to wave-top height, their propellers churning spray from the ocean surface. Twin-engine B-25 Mitchells, modified beyond recognition, bristled with forward-firing guns like no bomber he had ever seen. In Japan, such modifications would have required months of bureaucratic approval, years of testing. Yet here, the Americans had transformed medium bombers into ship killers in mere weeks. 6,900 soldiers of the 51st Division packed into 8 transport ships, their decks crammed with men who would never see the shores of New Guinea. The mathematics of destruction were being calculated not in staff rooms, but in the split-second timing of skip-bombing runs that would sink more Japanese ships in 15 minutes than submarines had managed in months. The transformation had begun 5 months earlier, in October 1942, when Major Paul Pappy Gunn, a former Navy pilot turned Army Air Force innovator, proposed something that violated every principle of bomber design. Strip out the bombardier compartment, replace it with 8 50-caliber machine guns, turn a vulnerable medium bomber into a strafing monster that could suppress ship defenses while delivering bombs at masthead height. His superiors called it madness. General George Kenney called it genius. Among the Japanese convoy steaming through the Bismarck Sea was Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commander of the 3rd Destroyer Flotilla, a man who had graduated 107th out of 118 cadets from the Imperial Naval Academy but had risen through sheer competence in destroyer operations. His flagship, Shirayuki, led 7 other destroyers escorting the vital reinforcement convoy: Aiyo Maru, Kembu Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Teiyo Maru, and the Navy transport Nojima Maru, each vessel packed beyond capacity with soldiers, ammunition, fuel, and the hopes of maintaining Japanese positions in New Guinea. Kimura had fought at Pearl Harbor as captain of the cruiser Suzuya, helped rescue survivors from Midway, earned respect throughout the fleet for his destroyer tactics. But nothing in his experience prepared him for what the Americans had created in the jungle workshops of Port Moresby. The journey from innovation to annihilation had begun in the humid workshops of northern Australia, where mechanics hammered aluminum sheets by hand, creating new nose cones for B-25s without factory tools or proper facilities. They worked by kerosene lamps through tropical nights, modifying aircraft in ways that Boeing engineers would have considered impossible. Each modification was tested over the wreck of SS Pruth, a merchantman that had run aground in 1923, now serving as target practice for a new kind of warfare. Pilots pushed their modified bombers down to 50 feet, then 20, then just 10 feet above the waves, learning through near-fatal trial and error how to skip 500-pound bombs across water like stones on a pond. February 28, 1943. Simpson Harbor, Rabaul. The loading of the convoy proceeded with Japanese efficiency as soldiers of the 51st Division filed aboard the transports. Private First Class Kenji Matsumoto, whose letters would be found floating in an oil-stained canvas bag weeks later, wrote to his mother about the magnificent sight of the destroyer escort. 8 sleek warships, veterans of every major engagement since Pearl Harbor. Surely nothing could threaten such protection. He described the loaded rifle stacks on deck, the machine gun positions hastily welded to transport rails, the confidence of officers who assured them that American bombers couldn't hit moving ships. The Japanese Navy had calculated acceptable losses at 40% of transports, considering this reasonable if even half the troops reached Leh. Unknown to Kimura's staff, American code breakers in Melbourne and Washington had been reading Japanese naval communications for weeks. Every detail of the convoy's composition, route, and timing flowed across Allied desks before the first soldier boarded. More devastating still, the Americans had been practicing. Not theoretical exercises in comfortable briefing rooms, but desperate, dangerous rehearsals, where B-25s slammed through their own bomb blasts, where pilots learned to release bombs at precisely the right instant to achieve the perfect skip trajectory. Lieutenant Colonel John Hennebrey of the 3rd Bomb Group had crashed one Mitchell into the mast of the practice wreck. Another had been so damaged by flying debris that it barely made it back to base. The first contact came March 1st, when a patrolling B-24 Liberator spotted the convoy through a break in the storm clouds that had been shielding the Japanese movement. 8 transports and 8 destroyers, exactly as intelligence had predicted, moving at 7 knots through heavy seas. The initial attacks by high-flying B-17 flying fortresses achieved what the Japanese expected: minimal damage, despite dozens of bombs dropped. One transport, Kyokusei Maru, took a direct hit and broke in half, its cargo of ammunition and fuel creating a pillar of fire visible for 20 miles. But 7 transports remained, and Japanese confidence held. That night, as the convoy regrouped and tended to survivors pulled from the oil-slicked waters, Admiral Kimura made a fateful decision. Rather than push through to Leh under cover of darkness, he would delay arrival until dawn, allowing for easier unloading in daylight. The weather was clearing, but Japanese reconnaissance reported no unusual Allied air activity. The Admiral's staff agreed that one more night at sea posed minimal additional risk. They had not detected the fevered preparations at Port Moresby, where ground crews worked through the night loading bombs and fueling aircraft. March 2nd brought scattered attacks that seemed to confirm Japanese assumptions. B-17s dropped bombs from 10,000 feet, their accuracy hampered by anti-aircraft fire and evasive maneuvering. 2 more transports sustained damage but remained afloat. The destroyer escorts darted between the transports, laying smoke screens and firing their anti-aircraft guns in practiced patterns. By sunset, they were within 150 miles of Leh, close enough to smell the jungle coastline. But in the pre-dawn darkness of March 3, 1943, something unprecedented was taking shape on the airfields around Port Moresby. 90 aircraft prepared for a coordinated strike unlike anything previously attempted in the Pacific War. B-17 flying fortresses would attack from medium altitude, not to sink ships but to force them to scatter. A-20 Havocs would suppress anti-aircraft positions with parafrag bombs. Australian Beaufighters would strafe from one direction, while modified B-25s approached from another, creating crossfire that would overwhelm Japanese defences. At 0750 hours, radar operator Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka aboard destroyer Shikinami reported multiple contacts approaching from the south. Not dozens, but scores of aircraft, flying in formations that made no tactical sense according to Japanese doctrine. Admiral Kimura ordered the convoy to maximum speed and initiated evasive maneuvers, but the transports, laden with troops and equipment, could barely manage 8 knots. The destroyers began laying smoke screens, but there weren't enough ships to protect the entire convoy. The first wave struck at 1000 hours. 13 B-17s dropped from 7,000 feet, their bombs bracketing the convoy in fountains of spray. As predicted, the ships scattered, each captain maneuvering independently. Into this chaos flew 13 Australian Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, approaching so low that Japanese gunners initially thought they were torpedo bombers. The ships turned to present narrow profiles, the standard defence against torpedo attack. Instead, the Beaufighters opened fire with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns per aircraft, raking the vessels from stem to stern. Flight Lieutenant William Newton, who would win a Victoria Cross for his actions over the following days, led his Beaufighter directly at destroyer Asashio, his cannons walking a line of explosions across her deck that killed most of the bridge crew in seconds. The Japanese had never experienced such concentration of firepower from aircraft. Their anti-aircraft doctrine, based on engaging high-altitude bombers, fell apart completely. Into this maelstrom flew Major Ed Lana's modified B-25s from the 90th Squadron. As they approached, 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns opened up from each bomber's nose, a concentrated stream of destruction that swept Japanese gun positions like a giant's broom. Then, at 300 yards, bombs released, skipping across the water in perfect trajectories learned through weeks of dangerous practice. The first skip bomb to connect was delivered by Lieutenant John Hennebrey against transport Teo Maru. The 500-pound bomb struck just above the waterline, penetrated the hull, and detonated in the engine room. The ship's midsection erupted outward, breaking her back instantly. Within 90 seconds, Teo Maru was gone, taking over 800 soldiers to the bottom. Admiral Kimura's flagship Shirayuki became the focus of concentrated attack. A skip bomb detonated her aft magazine, blowing the entire stern section off the destroyer. Kimura himself was wounded by machine gun fire that swept the bridge, bullets tearing through his shoulder and stomach as he tried to coordinate the convoy's defense. She went down in 4 minutes, her crew leaping from the tilted deck into water already thick with oil and bodies. Destroyer Shikinami managed to rescue Kimura and several dozen survivors before the flagship disappeared beneath the waves. The destruction accelerated beyond anything witnessed in previous Pacific naval engagements. Transport Nojima Maru, attempting to avoid a skip bombing run, collided with the damaged destroyer Arashio, entangling both vessels. Before they could separate, 3 B-25s concentrated their attacks on the stationary targets. Both vessels burst into flames, soldiers leaping directly into burning oil slicks. Captain Charles Howe, piloting B-25 number 980, made a devastating run against transport Io Maru, already listing from earlier attacks. His 4 skip bombs struck in perfect sequence along her waterline. He circled back, all 8 nose guns firing, strafing the soldiers attempting to launch lifeboats. In his after-action report, Howe wrote with clinical detachment about watching lifeboats overturn under his guns, soldiers tumbling into the sea like dolls. By 10:15 hours, just 15 minutes after the coordinated attack began, the convoy had ceased to exist as an organized force. 4 transports were already beneath the waves. 3 more were burning and sinking. The last, Oigawa Maru, was dead in the water, soldiers clinging to whatever flotsam they could find. Of the 8 destroyers, Shirayuki was gone, Arashio was burning and abandoned, Tokitsukaze was listing so severely that her captain ordered abandoned ship, and Asashio was circling aimlessly, her bridge crew dead, her rudder jammed. The second wave arrived at 1500 hours, finding 7 ships still afloat, though all were damaged. B-17s pattern-bombed from medium altitude, while B-25s made repeated strafing runs against survivors in the water. Lieutenant Walter Krell, flying a B-25 in the second wave, described seeing the ocean for 20 miles, covered with debris, life rafts, swimming men, and the dead floating face down in their kapok life vests. Destroyer Tokitsukaze finally succumbed to concentrated assault. Skip bombs from 3 B-25s struck simultaneously, lifting the 2,000-ton warship partially out of the water before she broke in half. Her depth charges detonated as she sank, killing hundreds of survivors swimming nearby. Destroyer Asashio became a sitting target with her steering damaged. 4 skip bombs turned her into a funeral pyre that burned through the night before finally sinking at dawn on March 4th. The killing continued into March 4th as PT boats and aircraft hunted survivors attempting to reach shore. Motor Torpedo Boat 143, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins, came across a Japanese submarine attempting to rescue survivors. In a brief engagement, the PT boat's guns slaughtered soldiers waiting in the water before driving off the submarine with depth charges. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding destroyer Shigure, which was not part of this convoy, would later write in his memoirs about hearing of the disaster and its impact on Japanese naval thinking. The captain of Yukikaze, one of only 4 destroyers to escape relatively intact, fled north at maximum speed, with 800 survivors, crammed on deck, machine gun bullets splashing in the ship's wake as American fighters made final strafing runs. The final tally defied comprehension. All 8 transports rested on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. 4 destroyers had joined them in the depths. Of the nearly 7,000 Japanese troops in the convoy, only about 800 reached Leh and 2,427 were returned to Rabaul. The official death toll was 3,664. The Americans lost 13 aircrew, with 1 B-17 and 3 P-38s shot down in combat, plus 1 B-25 and 1 Beaufighter lost in accidents, an exchange ratio that stunned military planners on both sides. The psychological impact on Japanese military thinking proved devastating. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the 18th Army waiting for reinforcements at Leh, received the news in stunned silence. His staff had war-gamed many scenarios, but nothing approaching total annihilation of a strongly escorted convoy. The American bombers had transformed from minor annoyances into deadly ship killers through innovation that violated the natural order of military development. In Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters initially refused to believe the reports. 8 transports and 4 destroyers lost to land-based bombers without a single American ship present seemed like fantasy. But the evidence was undeniable. Reconnaissance flights over the battle area found nothing but oil slicks and floating debris. The innovation that destroyed the convoy had been born of desperation and implemented through American pragmatism. When Major Pappy Gunn had first proposed converting B-25s, he had no authorization, no technical manuals, no factory support. He and his mechanics simply started cutting and welding. The skip bombing technique violated standard bombardment doctrine, requiring pilots to fly directly at enemy ships at suicidal altitudes. Yet they perfected it in weeks under combat conditions. For the Japanese military, wedded to rigid doctrine and formal procedures, such rapid adaptation was incomprehensible. Their bomber aircraft remained configured exactly as designed, their tactics unchanged from pre-war training. A Japanese pilot who modified his aircraft without authorization faced court-martial. An American pilot who improved his bomber's effectiveness received a medal. The consequences rippled throughout the Pacific War. Japanese commanders could no longer risk surface convoys within range of Allied air bases, effectively isolating their scattered garrisons. Supplies had to be moved by submarine or fast destroyer runs under cover of darkness, reducing logistics to a trickle. The garrison at Lae never recovered. When Australian forces attacked months later, they found defenders weakened by disease, malnutrition, and ammunition shortages that traced directly to the convoy's destruction. Admiral Kimura, recovering from his wounds in Rabaul, submitted a report that challenged fundamental assumptions about naval warfare. Aircraft, he argued, had made traditional surface escorts obsolete when operating within enemy air range. The concentration of firepower achieved by modified bombers exceeded anything destroyers could counter. His recommendations for convoy protection were implemented too late. The technical details of American innovation reached Japanese intelligence, creating both admiration and despair. The forward-firing guns installed on B-25s required no new technology, just imagination to use existing weapons differently. Skip bombing relied on basic physics understood since childhood. Yet the Japanese military system, with its emphasis on perfection and orthodoxy, could never have produced such innovations. In the broader Pacific War context, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a fundamental shift. Air superiority, specifically innovative application of air power, had trumped sea power in ways naval theorists hadn't anticipated. The Americans demonstrated capacity for innovation that would characterize the remainder of the war. General Douglas MacArthur proclaimed it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. General George Kenney celebrated vindication of his tactics, immediately ordering more bombers modified and more pilots trained in skip bombing. Within months, skip bombing became standard procedure throughout the Pacific. For the Japanese, the disaster prompted complete re-evaluation of their Southwest Pacific strategy. The decision to abandon surface reinforcement of New Guinea bases effectively ceded initiative to the Allies. From March 1943 onward, Japanese forces in the region fought a steadily losing defensive battle, unable to receive significant reinforcements while Allied strength grew exponentially. The human cost extended beyond statistics. Thousands of Japanese families received notification that their sons were missing in action, bodies never recovered from the Bismarck Sea depths. Letters found floating in debris revealed hopes and fears of young soldiers who had trusted their navy's protection. Among American aircrew, the battle produced complex feelings. Many pilots who strafed survivors struggled with what they'd done, even understanding military necessity. Lieutenant Walter Krell suffered nightmares for years, haunted by images of men swimming desperately away from his approaching bomber. The tactical innovations spread rapidly throughout Allied forces. Skip bombing proved effective against all Japanese vessels, from coastal barges to cruisers. By war's end, hundreds of Japanese vessels had fallen victim to these attacks, crews learning to fear the distinctive drone of Mitchells flying just above waves. The battle demonstrated critical importance of intelligence in modern warfare. Allied codebreakers provided not just warning but precise details, allowing optimal positioning of striking forces. This intelligence advantage, combined with tactical innovation and aggressive execution, created perfect conditions for convoy destruction. For military historians, the Bismarck Sea represents a watershed in air power evolution. Traditional naval vessels, no matter how well armed or skillfully handled, proved vulnerable to concentrated air attack, employing innovative tactics. Surface naval dominance faced new threat from land-based aircraft striking hundreds of miles from bases. The technological simplicity made American innovations particularly significant. No radar, no guided weapons, no jet engines, just existing technology applied differently. Machine guns moved from defensive to offensive mountings, standard bombs employed unconventionally, medium bombers used as attack aircraft. These innovations required no scientific breakthrough, just imagination and courage. Japanese survivors spoke of shock at American firepower and tactics. Seaman Yukio Tanaka, rescued by destroyer Yukikaze after transport Teo Maru exploded, described attacking B-25s as demons, nose guns breathing fire, while bombs skipped across water like stones thrown by giants. Coordination of attacks from multiple altitudes created sensory overload, paralyzing decision-making. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto studied battle reports with growing pessimism. He had predicted Japan could run wild 6 months to a year before American industrial might shifted balance. The Bismarck Sea proved American innovation could accelerate that timeline. The battle demonstrated American advantages beyond material superiority, their flexibility and willingness to experiment giving tactical advantages no amount of Japanese courage could overcome. The battle influenced post-war military doctrine significantly. The United States Air Force, established as independent service in 1947, cited the Bismarck Sea as validation of strategic air power theory. Naval planners recognized vulnerability of surface vessels to air attack, accelerating development of surface-to-air missiles and radar-controlled anti-aircraft systems. Strategic implications extended throughout the Pacific theater. Japanese bases in the Solomons could no longer expect reinforcement by sea. The garrison at Rabaul became increasingly isolated. Operation Cartwheel, MacArthur's campaign to isolate Rabaul, succeeded partly because Japanese couldn't risk major convoy operations after the Bismarck Sea disaster. In Japan, news was suppressed, reported only as minor losses during successful reinforcement. True scale remained hidden until after war, when occupation forces discovered Japanese records detailing catastrophe. Many families never learned specific fate of loved ones, whether killed by bombs, bullets, or drowning in oil-choked waters. Skip bombing evolution continued throughout war, techniques refined based on combat experience. Delayed action fuses perfected to ensure bombs penetrated deep before detonating. By 1945, skip bombing had become so routine, new pilots considered it standard procedure, unaware of revolutionary origins in desperate 1943 improvisations. For Admiral Kimura, who survived war despite wounds, the battle remained a defining moment. In post-war interviews, he praised American innovation while lamenting Japanese inflexibility. Same destroyer tactics that succeeded at Java Sea proved useless against skip-bombing B-25s. Americans changed engagement rules, and Japanese military system proved incapable of adapting quickly enough. The convoy wreckage still lies scattered across Bismarck Sea floor, underwater graveyard, testifying to devastating effectiveness of American innovation. Modern sonar has located most wrecks, positions corresponding to contemporary action reports. These serve as war graves, protected by international law, exploration restricted out of respect for dead. Technical reports filed after battle provided blueprints for future operations. What began as desperate improvisation became military science, taught in classrooms and practiced on ranges. Innovation cycle from invention through standardization took less than 6 months. Japanese naval doctrine never fully recovered. Subsequent operations relied on submarines and high-speed destroyer runs at night, tactics delivering only fractions of needed supplies. Inability to protect surface convoys essentially ceded daylight control to Allied forces. Japanese Navy, built for decisive surface engagement, found itself reduced to operating in darkness. In military academies worldwide, The Battle of the Bismarck Sea is studied as example of operational innovation defeating tactical superiority. Japanese destroyer captains executed tactics flawlessly, crews performed with courage, equipment functioned as designed, yet they were annihilated by enemy who changed fundamental nature of engagement. Modern naval forces internalized lessons, developing layered air defense systems that would have seemed science fiction in 1943. Yet fundamental lesson remains: innovation in tactics can overcome superiority in technology. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as testament to power of innovation over tradition, flexibility over rigidity, adaptation over doctrine. In just 15 minutes of coordinated attack on March 3, 1943, American and Australian aircrews destroyed not just Japanese convoy, but entire conception of naval warfare. Skip bombing, developed through dangerous experimentation, achieved what conventional bombing failed to accomplish in 2 years of war. For Japanese soldiers who perished in those waters, the battle was tragedy of misplaced trust in traditional naval power. Their deaths proved fallacy of assumptions most brutally. Waters of Bismarck Sea became their grave, sacrifice ultimately meaningless as Japan's position in New Guinea collapsed without reinforcements they were meant to provide. The convoy departing Rabaul, February 28, 1943, carried more than soldiers and supplies. It carried last hopes of maintaining Japanese expansion in Southwest Pacific. Its destruction proved definitively that warfare had changed, that air power properly employed could neutralize sea power, that innovation could overcome tradition. Men who died were victims not just of American bombs, but their own military system's inability to adapt to changing reality. Waters of Bismarck Sea have long since cleared, wrecks have become coral-encrusted monuments to dead. But lessons endure. Innovation matters more than tradition. Flexibility defeats rigidity. These truths, written in blood March 1943, remain relevant to every military organization where established practice meets revolutionary thinking. Battle of Bismarck Sea was not just military victory, but triumph of innovation, resonating far beyond its specific historical moment.